Chapter 13: Managing Human Resources in Organizations. The learning objectives of this chapter will include an understanding of the environmental context of human resource management, and that would also include the strategic importance and the relationship human resource management in organizations has with legal and social factors of the general environment. Also, we'll be looking at how organizations attract human resources, and we know human resources is one of the resources that are managed or that are required to be managed effectively and efficiently within organizations. So we'll be looking at how organizations can actually attract those resources that are human resources, and that would include how organizations go about human resource planning, recruiting, and selection. Also, we'll be looking at how organizations develop these human resources, and that would include how they go about training and development, how they go about appraising the performance of their human resources, and also providing performance feedbacks to employees of the organization. Further on the learning objectives, we'll be looking at how organizations actually maintain the human resources, right? And this would include the determination of compensation. How do they remunerate their human resources? How do they pay them for services delivered? And also, how do they provide benefits to their employees, and also what kind of benefits are provided to employees and the career planning of employees of organizations. Also, we'll be looking at the key issues that are associated with managing knowledge and contingent and temporary workers. The strategic importance of human resource management. Now, human resource management, also denoted as HRM, is the set of organizational activities that are directed at attracting, developing, and maintaining an effective workforce, labor force, or an effective employees of an organization. And human capital actually reflects the organization's investment in attracting, retaining, and motivating an effective workforce. And human capital also is representative of the people of an organization that contribute to the success of that organization. Now, there's this it tells you that there's an environmental context to human resource management, right? Because when you're looking at attracting people, you're actually attracting people from the external environment, right? And when you're talking about retaining and motivating an effective workforce, you're looking at the internal environment, because when those employees come on board, they're actually part of the internal environment. So we'll be looking at the environmental context of human resource management, right? And something I would like us to note is that HR, which is representative of human resources rather, and HC, which is representative of human capital, they can be used interchangeably, right? And the strategic importance of human resource management basically is all about the human resource management function, as we can see, has become more and more important in recent times, right? And its new importance basically stems from the legal complexities that surround human resource management, right? And it's also the recognition that human resource management are a valuable means for improving productivity. So all those actually impacted the importance of human resource management. Also, there's also an increased awareness by organizations of the costs associated with pure, or rather poor, human resource management. So that has also increased the importance of human resource management in recent times, right? Now, the responsibility for human resource management functions is shared between the HR managers, or the HR department rather, and line managers. So basically, human resource management, because managers have to appraise their subordinates, provide performance feedback, help them in actually setting performance targets. You find out that having to develop, having to maintain human resources, human resources, or the employees of an organization is not just a function of the HR department, but also is extended to managers of such employees or subordinates, right, within an organization. Now, you find out that the HR department may recruit and initially screen candidates, but the final selection is made by managers in the department where these new employees will work. So you find out that HR function is not just or it's not just specific to human resource department, but is also a part of the function of managers of an organization, right? And that is something we have discussed earlier on, because human resources is one of the four resources that are managed within an organization. Now, similarly, we find out that the HR department may also establish performance appraisal policies and procedures, but the actual evaluation and coaching of employees are done by their immediate supervisors, right? So you find out that that actually emphasizes the role of managers of subordinates that are not even in human resource management, but what role they have to play towards managing human resources of an organization, right? So the term human capital, something I want us to note is that when you use the term human capital, is reflective of how much an organization invests, or an organization's commitment to its people, right? Or how much financial resources are actually allocated to the human resources of an organization. That is why it is called human capital. The legal environment of human resource management, right? This would comprise concepts relating to equal employment opportunity, compensation and benefits, labor relations, health and safety, emerging legal issues, social change, and human resource management, if that makes sense, right? And we'll find out that a number of laws actually regulate various aspects of employer employee relations, right? Especially in the areas of this equal employment opportunity, compensation and benefits, labor relations, maybe, and not labor relations, maybe, but labor relations inclusive, and occupational health, occupational health and safety. But in this chapter, we wouldn't be discussing labor relations in depthly. Now, also, we'll be looking at equal employment opportunity, one of those regulations or laws that are extant that relate to human resource management. And under that, we'll be looking at the regulation or law called Title 7, right? Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this basically forbids discrimination when it comes to employment on the basis of sex, race, color, religion, or national origin, right? And discrimination basically said to occur when an employment requirement has an adverse effect, right? An other adverse effect or adverse impact will be when minority group members meet or pass a selection standard at a rate less than 80% of majority group members, right? So that would be an adverse impact, and that would be considered discrimination most often than not, right? And also we'll be looking at equal employment. But one thing I would want us to note is that this Title 7 was really the beginning of the legal environment with regards to human resource management, right? Also, we'll be looking at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, right? So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is basically the federal agency that is charged with enforcing the Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Further on the legal environment of human resource management, also be looking at Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, right? And this outlaws discrimination against people that are older than 40 years, right? And I mean, this is very unique because where I come from, which is Nigeria, you find out that in government establishments, people that are 40 and above are really not employed for are really not availed first time employment, right? There's a discrimination based on age. But here in the US environment, you find out that there's a law that actually forbids that, which is this Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967. Also, we'll be looking at, like, also we have the Pregnancy Discrimination Act rather, which forbids discrimination against women who are pregnant. Now, I want us to know that this is equally very unique because during my time in the human resource management in the industry, there was a particular situation whereby we had offered employment. We had actually issued an employment letter to an applicant or someone who was going to come on board the organization, and at the point they were going to resume, we realized that the person was very heavy and was going to be due very soon. So what happened was that we had to extend the resumption date of this employee, right? And that may be considered some sort of discrimination because this employee had indicated they wanted to resume at that particular date, but having to extend that because basically for first time employments where I come from in Nigeria is expect or rather not first time employment, but having to come on board an organization as a new employee, most often than not in government organizations, you will see that people who are very heavy because the reason why we extended the resumption date was that this person was going to put to bed during her probation period, right? And how do I mean? Where I used to work, we had a 1 year probation period for employees, after which they had some form of job security or permanence of employment. But what would happen is that it's expected that employees should be within the organization for that 1 year period for their performance to be fully evaluated. But someone who's pregnant or an employee who's pregnant, most often than not, within a 1 year period, will put to bed and will be required to go on a maternity leave of 116 days, which is about 4 months, give or take, right? And that would actually eat into the 1 year period of probation. So the idea is for the person or for the employee not to have an a broken period in their probation tenure or in their probation period, right? So that was actually the idea behind extending the resumption date. But this Pregnancy Discrimination Act will actually forbid that in the U.S. environment. Still on the legal environment of human resource management and looking at the equal employment opportunity, right? You have what is called the affirmative action, right? And it basically is about intentionally seeking and hiring qualified or qualifiable employees from racial, sexual, and ethnic groups that are underrepresented in the organization, right? So it's basically trying to create a balance for people who are underrepresented so that there's some form of equal representation. So this basically refers to a set of executive orders that requires companies that contract with federal government to seek and hire underrepresented groups, right? That's what the affirmative action is all about. And where I come from, something similar to that in government establishment is something you would call the Federal Character Commission, right? Or Federal Character law or regulation, which actually behoves on government organizations to have an equal representation of all the ethnic or all the geopolitical zones in Nigeria, right? So that's all about the affirmative action, how it applies in Nigeria, and that is very, very similar to what is obtainable too in the United States environment. We're still on the legal environment of human resource management, and we'll be looking at equal employment opportunity. Under that, we'll be looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? And this regulation, actually, or act of the legislature, forbids discrimination against people with disabilities, right? And it requires employers in the American environment to provide reasonable accommodations for disabled workers, right? This is also kind of replicated in Nigeria, where I come from, because you find out that most government agencies in Nigeria actually endeavor to have a quota for people living with disabilities in their workforce, right? And provisions are actually made in organizations too in Nigeria for people with disabilities, because you find out that there are ramps that are built within organizations or government organizations in Nigeria. Also, be looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1991, right? This amends the original Civil Rights Act that used to be before 1991, making it easier to bring discrimination lawsuits while actually limiting punitive damages. So this was actually a repealed law that was reenacted in 1991, right, to provide for or rather to accommodate for lawsuits when there's some form of there's some form of infringement of civil rights within or in the sphere of employment, right? And this civil rights acts of 1991, like we said, basically, since it was reenacted, strengthens the ability of workers to bring discrimination lawsuits about organizations they work for. Still on the legal environment of human resource management, under compensation, right? Compensation of the human resources of an organization, there are federal regulations or acts that actually impact how much or how organizations remunerate their employees. Now, on that, we'll be looking at the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, or what you call as an acronym the FLSA, right? It basically sets a minimum wage and requires overtime pay for work in excess of 40 hours per week, right? And that was passed in 1938 and amended frequently ever since then. Now, when we talk about paying overtime for work done in excess of 40 hours, that would actually apply to employees that are non-exempt. So under the FLSA, employees that are non-exempt actually are people that earn below a particular cap, a particular amount within a year, and people that do non-professional jobs, if that makes sense. So this overtime pay for hours worked over 40 hours or for over 40 hours in a week doesn't apply to all employees of an organization. It basically applies to employees of an organization that are called non-exempt employees, employees that are non-exempt from the FLSA, but employees that are exempt of the FLSA, this doesn't apply to them because they are probably paid salaries, they are not paid wage, or they are not paid hourly. So this FLSA actually applies to employees that are not paid salary, do not do, or rather do not do professional jobs, right? And also we have the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that requires that men and women be paid the same amount for doing the same job, right? Although there are exceptions that are permitted for seniority and performance pay. So how do I mean by this, or why did this law or regulation come to being in the first place? Now, there was a time, even in the United States environment, when men and women that actually did the same job earned differently. Actually, the situation was that the men actually earned more than the women. I don't know what the basis for that was, but that happened. So this particular act actually came to stem that down. So basically, based on this act, any female employee who realizes that a male employee who does the same kind of jobs or has the same functions or is on the same status or the same job level in an organization, but the male employee actually earns better, they could actually bring up issues with the organization based on this Equal Pay Act of 1963. We're still on the legal environment of human resource management, right? And we'll be looking at what benefits employers actually provide to their employees, or what benefits to organizations actually, or what are the laws that relate to the benefits organizations provide to their employees. Now, on that, we'll be looking at the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, or something that the acronym is called ERISA, right? And this is a law that sets the standards for a pension plan, right? And it provides federal insurance if pensions or pension plans actually go bankrupt. So it's basically providing for some form of income security for employees after they exit an organization, right? Or when they are not they're not capable to actually be in the workforce of an organization anymore when they've maybe attained their retirement age, right? So you find out that, or maybe they are not able to proceed with the employment because of maybe injuries, right? So this ERISA would actually provide for some form of insurance whereby they keep earning when they are done or when they have exited an organization, right? And that's a legal requirement for organizations to put in place. Also, we'll be looking at the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, otherwise called the FMLA, right? And it basically requires employers to provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave for family and medical emergencies. Actually, in the United States environment, this applies differently to people or to people in the military, right? Or relatives of people in the military, because they could be afforded more days or more weeks beyond the 12 weeks, right? To basically cater to their relatives who are in the militaries, right? So the Family and Medical Leave Act, which actually allows for 12 weeks for employees of an organization, extends beyond 12 weeks for either people in the military or relatives of people in the military. We're still discussing the legal environment of human resource management. Now we're looking at the National Labor Relations Act, and this act is also known as the Wagner Act. It basically establishes guidelines for forming a union, and it requires that organizations bargain collectively with a properly established union, right? And as we can see, this act was passed in 1935, and also we'll look at the National Labor Relations Board, which is also established by the Wagner Act to actually enforce whatever provisions or regulations that are established by this act, right? And also we'll be looking at the Labor Management Relations Act. This act is also called the Taft-Hartley Act, and it was passed to establish a balance between organizations and unions. You understand? And it allows the president, for instance, it allows for the president of United States to actually prevent or end a strike that would threaten national security. Looking at the legal environment of human resource management in relation to health and safety, there's a legislation for regulation of health and safety, right? And that would be the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. And this legislation basically requires that employers or organizations obey the safety and health standards that are established by the US Department of Labor, right? It mandates that these organizations provide a safe working environment for their employees, right? And in providing a safe working environment, that basically means that the work environment within the organization should be free from hazard or situations that may cause for the death or serious physical harm of employees, right? Finally, on the legal environment of human resource management, we're looking at the emerging legal issues, and emerging legal issues relate to situations of sexual harassment within the workplace or an organization. And for sexual harassment, the legal instrument that forbids that in the workplace would be the Title 7, right? And also we'll see that in as much as Title 7 forbids that cases of sexual harassment still are existing within organizations or in the workplace. Also talk about alcohol and drug dependencies, right? You find out that in the US environment, based off court rulings, people who are addicted to alcohol or drug, they are actually considered to be persons or individuals living with disabilities. So employees of an organization or employees of an organization, whenever they are actually addicted or dependent on alcohol or drugs, that would be considered a disability in the US environment. Now talk about AIDS, HIV AIDS in the workplace, right? You find out that there are laws also protecting for disability or for discrimination against people living with AIDS, right? And those people living with AIDS, if they are employees of an organization, they should be considered by virtue of the legal instruments existing in the US, they should be considered people living with disabilities, right? Also, the Title 7 actually is extended to employees of an organization who fall under the LGBTQ, because basically the Title 7 is meant to um stem discrimination in the workplace, right? Also, another dimension of the legal environment of human resource management that we'll be looking at is how human resource management intersects with social change. And in that vein, we'll be looking at what is called employment at will. Employment at will is just a traditional view of the workplace, which basically stipulates that an organization or an employer can fire their employees for whatever reasons they want, right? But in recent times, we find out that some court rulings actually limit the extent to which employment at will can be actually implemented in the workplace. Human resource planning. The starting point for attracting human resources to an organization would be planning, right? And you find out that HR planning involves both job analysis and forecasting the supply and demand of labor, right? So, looking at job analysis would be a systemized procedure for collecting and recording information about jobs within an organization, right? And I mean, it will be a systematic analysis of jobs within an organization. And job analysis has two dimensions. The first will be job description, and the other would be job specification. Or rather, it has two elements, which are job description and job specification. And job description would be a listing of the job's duties, its working conditions, and tools, materials, and equipment used to perform the job, right? So it's basically about emphasizing what the responsibilities that are required for that job function are, basically explaining for what tools or what other requirements that will be needed by someone, an employee who has to perform that role, right? It basically enumerates what the role entails, right? Every task or responsibility that is required for that role occupied by an employee of an organization. But beyond that, also stating whatever equipment like working tools, like a computer, for instance. Some employee working in an office may require a computer, right? If that job function requires the use of a computer, then it will also be captured in the job description. Whereas job specification, on the other hand, has to do with a listing of the knowledge, skills, and abilities and other credentials whoever is gonna undertake the functions of that job, or whoever is going to take up that job function or job role is going to be equipped with. So it's basically telling you the person's specification, the employee specification that would be a fit for that role to ensure quality performance in that role. So it tells you what the knowledge, skills, abilities, all the capabilities or competencies of whoever is going to occupy that role. How how much capabilities or what the extent of capabilities they would possess for them to be very, very effective in those roles. That would be captured under the job specification. So it specifies the person specification that is a fit for that job role. This diagram on human resource planning basically enumerates the phases in human resource planning, right? And you can see that at the top of the process is you start with having to access trends in the external labor markets, right? Having to see if there's more demand or more supply of labor or human resources in the labor market, availability of the the persons that organizations may want to hire to actually take up some job functions or to occupy some job roles. So assessing what the labor market is about, whether there will be availability of human resource in the labor market, right? That will be one of the things that are done in the first phase. Also, assessing the trends in current employees to know how many of your employees may be retiring, how many of the employees, what is the trend among employees? Are lots of employees leaving, or are lots of employees, or do you forecast, or do you see a trend leading to a lot of vacancies. That's kind of what is done also at the first stage, right? And you want to look at what are your organizational plans or objectives in the future, right? What would be the requirement for human resources given the organization's mission going forward, or the organization's plan or organizational strategy in trying to achieve or implement those strategies? What would be the human resource needs? That's why HR of an organization or a manager would want to basically check for or consider what your future organizational plans are, right? Also, you also want to look at the general economic trends, because basically when the economy is bad, you find out that people are less likely to leave their jobs, right? Because it's possible that there may be no available jobs for them to take up in the event that they leave their job. So if the economy is maybe a vibrant one, then there may be the possibility that there will be vacancies or employees leaving the organization, or maybe that there may be less less supply of labor, less supply of human resources in the labor market, right? So based off all these considerations, a manager or a HR manager may be able to predict what the human resource demands of the organization would be going forward, right? And based off the prediction, whether there would be vacancies or whether they are or whether people will be leaving, right? Establishing that there may be a need, right? A demand, then there's something done once the demand has been predicted. There is either there's a forecast for internal supply of such human resource that is needed or that is in demand by the organization, or that there will be a forecast of the external supply. So forecasting for the internal supply would require maybe the organization doing what you call a talent audit, right, or a skills audit, basically reviewing the employees that are already existing within the organization to check for which employees within the organization probably possess the knowledge, skills, and abilities, whatever competencies that are required for the role that is considered vacant, or the role that a demand has been predicted for, right? So why an organization does that is, for instance, if there was some talent internally that could actually occupy those positions, then organizations can actually redeploy such talents accordingly, right? Rather than having to recruit from outside. Now, having to forecast external supply is basically looking at what the labor market is like. If there's enough supply of human resources, or if there is a scarce, if human resources in the labor market is scarce, right? That's why one would want to forecast external supply as well, right? So even in forecasting internal supply, the organization beyond a talent audit may also be looking out for the employees that are up, that will be going for promotion, or maybe vertical job loading, right? If for instance is a vacant position at a higher level, and there's an employee who is competent enough to occupy that position but isn't at that level enough already, talent audit may equally look into how much time the employee has to get to the next level, right, for the next promotion, and see if that is in tandem with when the organization would require such human resource, right? So those are the things that are to be considered. Or the organization may also, in forecasting internal supply, they may also consider horizontal job loading, whereby a manager internally or an employee internally who has the capabilities to occupy that vacancy that has been identified within the organization, or that demand for human resource that has been predicted within the organization, they could, as an organization, add that the responsibilities of that vacant role to an employee of an organization who has the capabilities to actually handle that role, but is currently handling a particular job role within the organization. So they can actually add on to the employee's job role those responsibilities of the vacant role, and that may be considered horizontal job loading, whereby more tasks are added onto the ones that are being performed by an employee, right? So after doing both the internal and external supply forecast, right, the organization or the human resource manager may now compare what the future demand and the internal supply could be before planning to deal with the predicted shortfalls or cases. There could be cases of overstaffing, whereby there are employees who are redundant or not doing enough tasks or taking on enough responsibilities within the organization for however much they are being paid. Matching human resource demand and supply. we find out that after managers of an organization understand the jobs that are to be performed within the organization, right? Maybe it could be because of the organization's future objectives, or it could be because of the trends within the organization, right? After that has been done, then you find out that those managers within organizations can now start planning for the organization's future human resource needs, right? And you find out that the manager starts by assessing trends in past human resource usage, future organization plans, like we said, and the general economic trends, right? So a good sales or revenue forecast may be a good way to start in a situation like this, right? Especially if the organization is a small organization, right? Now, also, we understand that historical ratios can also be used to predict the demand of employees, right? What has happened in the past that could actually be used for forecasting, right? So the forecasting of the supply of labor basically involves forecasting the internal supply, like we said in the earlier slide, right? And the forecasting of internal supply, like we said, is about the number and type of employees who will be in the firm, right, at some future date. That's about internal supply. And also, another way to forecast the supply of labor, like we said earlier on, will be forecasting the external supply, right? External supply is about the number and type of people that will be available for hiring in the job market, like we already said, right? So under that internal supply and all those, so this those forecasts all relate to the anticipated personnel changes, like we talked about, right? When those vacancies are identified, right, within the organization, then that way organization is basically making plans towards checking if they have available employees within the organization that can occupy those vacancies, or there are ones outside the organization. Now also we'll be looking at what you call the replacement chart. This is used to plan for management positions basically within organizations, right? What the replacement chart does is that it lists all the important managerial positions in the organization and who occupy them, right? And how long those people occupying them will remain in the position, or who else will be eligible or definitely up to the status to take up those responsibilities in the event that people currently occupying them actually leave those positions, right? Also, we'll be looking at, under internal supply, we'll also be looking at the employee information system, right? Which is used for skills inventory, or what we call the talent audit, like I told you, having to check for what skills or talents that are available within the organization that would be able to actually occupy those vacant position or the vacant position, right? So a skill inventory can be used to identify individuals, right, who are ready for a transfer or promotion. So we talked about the promotion part, right, earlier on. So an employee information system is usually computerized, right? It's usually a software most often than not. Like where I used to work, our employee information system was the EHR, right? EHR is a software too, right? So this employee information system would contain information on employees' education, skills, experience, their career aspirations, right? All of those are captured under employee information systems, and these are digitized systems. Still on matching human resource demand and supply. Now, external supply would have to be what are the would be about availability of employees in the labor market, like we said, and the considerations organizations would basically make with regards to that would be looking at state employment commissions data, right, government reports, also, and looking at what college graduation records are, like how many students have been churned out of the university or colleges, right, to know how much supply of labor would be, how much supply of human resources there will be in the labor market, given the number of graduates or number of students that are graduating from the higher institution, right? So we find out that, like we said earlier on, after organizations compare their future demand, right, and internal supply, basically, or even the external supply, managers can keep making plans to manage those predicted shortfalls in human resources, or it could be shortfalls, or they could look at the trend and see that maybe they are overstaffed, maybe that there are some redundant employees within the organization, right? So that's the case. So if a shortfall, whereby is a shortfall, whereby there's a vacancy, or whereby there will be need for some human resources at some point, new employees can be hired, right, from outside the organization, right? Or even their existing employees, like we said, if there are people who could take up such positions, right? Those employees, for instance, if they require some other capabilities that could be provided for by training, those employees can be trained or retrained as the case may be, right? And transferred accordingly or redeployed accordingly to those vacant positions within the organization, right? So individuals also another way an organization can actually approach a shortfall in demand from an internal perspective would be to persuade employees of an organization that are almost due to retire, having to persuade them to actually stay on the job, right? That is one way for organizations to ensure that vacancies are filled within the organization, right? Also, we find out that if the situation is a situation of overstaffing, right, whereby there are more human resources within the organization than the organization needs, right, that would be a problem also. But the main options or the approach an organization could take towards this will be to actually redeploy those extra employees or those employees who are probably considered redundant or who are the basis for overstaffing. They can actually redeploy them to other job functions within the organization, right? And also another way organizations could actually do to stem overstaffing down would be to cease hiring, right? So as people or employees who are with the organization are exiting, the employee does not go on to recruit more, given that they already are overstaffed, right? And also another way an organization could actually deal with overstaffing when it's an issue is to encourage what we call early retirement, right? They can provide some incentive that would encourage some people who are close to retirement to retire long before they do, right? And those incentives might come in form of what we call severance packages, right? Severance packages are usually very attractive, so attractive that it kind of becomes very appealing to people who are long yet to retire, that it appeals to them in such a way that they can give up employment immediately and retire, given how much financial benefits such severance package may contain, right? Another way they could do or manage overstaffing would actually be to lay off people, right? Lay off employees who maybe aren't performing up to the expectations of the organization. That would be one way they can manage overstaffing as well. Recruiting employees. We know that the moment organizations have an idea of what their future human resource needs are, right? The next thing such organizations do would be to actually recruit, right? Recruit new employees. And what's recruitment or recruiting? It's basically the process of attracting individuals to apply for a job position that is vacant, right? And you find out that some qualified recruits may be found internally, like we said, right? So an internal recruitment will be when an organization might provide a criteria for, say, this is the criteria for people who are within the organization who wish to go up for this position. This is the criteria they should meet, and an organization may actually conduct some recruitment exercise internally, right? So what they call it would be in the industry, what they call it is actually declaring internal vacancy, right? When I used to be in HR, having to actually recruit people internally to fill vacant positions is what we call it in HR is to declare internal vacancy, right? That's how you can recruit internally. But also organizations may look outside, look into the labor market to recruit from outside the organization, right? Now internal recruiting, like we said, is promotion from within, right? The organization is basically declaring an internal vacancy, like I told you, that's the word in the industry, right? And that means that they are basically considering their current employees as applicants for those higher level jobs within the organization, right? And you find out that most often than not, right, internal recruitment builds the morale of existing employees, and it equally reduces turnover of high quality employees because it makes it clear to them that given that they are high quality employees, that the opportunity exists that someday some opportunity may come for some of them to apply for higher level positions given internal recruiting, right? Also, this form of recruitment could actually cause a ripple effect, which is that the disadvantage is whereby someone who is filling that position from within the organization is definitely creating a vacancy from where for whatever job function they are leaving to occupy the other job function, right? So that would be the ripple effect, whereby filling one vacancy creates another vacancy all together, right? So what is external recruiting all about? It's just about attracting people from outside, like we said, from the labor market or outside the organization, having to attract them to apply for those jobs, right? And some methods for external recruiting will be to advertise those positions, right? Having to post them online, right? Also doing interviews on campus, right? Looking out for students that are about to leave the higher institution, right? Also looking at employment agencies or executive search firms, right? Those are kind of areas or approaches an organization could take or adopt towards hiring from outside, right? Also, we'll be looking at what you call a realistic job preview, right? It has to do with when you're trying to recruit from outside the organization. What a realistic job preview basically does is to provide job applicants that are external to the organization, provide them with information on the real picture of what it's like to perform a job or perform the job that the organization is trying to hire them for, right? So you give them a true picture of what a day on the job that they are trying to apply for, what it looks like, what it feels like, right? So you find out that an organization that actually adopts a realistic job preview in its recruitment process, right? What they do is to ensure that those job applicants have an accurate understanding of the job that they are coming in to do, right? And also that they also have an understanding of the expectations the organization has for them while delivering on the job, right? So that's basically what a realistic job preview does. Selecting employees. We find out that once the recruitment process or the recruiting process has attracted a pool of applicants, right, the next step after that would be to select an applicant or a person that actually is fit, right? Also, you find out that the intention of the idea behind the selection process is to gather as much information from the applicant, right, that will help predict for how well such an applicant or individual will do when they're hired, right? So you find out that having to determine how successful they would be is what is done during the selection process, having to look into all the information regarding those job applicants. Now, the organization also can gather information only about factors that are predictive of future performance, right? And you find out that the process for determining the extent to which a selection device is really predictive of the future job performance or how well that person is going to do when they are hired to do the job. The extent that this is determined is what we call validation, right? So validation basically is the process of determining the predictive value of information that is gathered from those job applicants, how well such information gathered from them is able to predict for their future success on the job when they are hired, right? Also, we'll be looking at what is called the application forms and resumes as an instrument used for selecting employees, right? So the application forms and resumes, what they are used for is basically to gather information about the work history of the job applicants, their educational background, and other job related demographic data, right? So when we say demographic data, it's telling you about the personal information of whatever job applicant. It could be their work history, their education, right? It could even be their personal information, like I told you, like their names. All those are part of, like, their name, gender, and all that. That is part of demographic data, right? And you find out that these application forms and resumes also do not have to ask for information that is not related to the job for which the job applicant is being hired for or is being considered for, right? Also, these tools, like the application form and resume, that's what I refer to as these tools. They are used to decide if a candidate actually is deserving of further evaluation, right? If they merit further evaluation. Also, it provides interviewers with the candidate's information, right? So if there is a panel of interviewers having to use organizations having to use these application forms and resumes actually is helpful because it now provides the panelists, right? Or yeah, it now provides the panelists or people who are engaged in selection. It provides them those interviewers, right, that are in the panel. It provides them with the job applicants information. Another way of selecting employees would be to test them, right? Employees that are to be hired within an organization. How it's done is to testing, and testing basically is used to measure, evaluate for competencies that are relevant to the job. In recruiting, I believe you must have heard what's called aptitude tests, right? Aptitude tests are basically to check for how well an employee, also check for to measure for the competencies of that job applicant. So this test check for ability, skill, aptitude, or knowledge, right? And they are usually the best predictors of job success, right? Now, tests must be validated, administered, and scored consistently. Now, the testing process also has to be the same for all the job applicants that are applying for a specific position within an organization. Selecting employees. We're still looking at selecting employees, and we find out that this could be done using interviews, right? And interviews may be considered like a popular selection device, right? Most often than not, we hear that in hiring processes, we hear of interviews, right? But interviews may be a poor predictor of how successful that employee that is being or that individual that is being considered for hiring, how successful they will be eventually on the job. Interviews may be a poor predictor for that. And why is that the case? It's because of inherent interviewer biases that may exist or inconsistencies that may exist during the interview process. So, how would interviews be actually made, or how can interviews be improved to actually be good predictors of success or how successful that job applicant will be eventually on the job? How this can be done is basically says that interviewer biases can be overcome, right? And those inconsistencies that exist during the interview process can actually be overcome also, and the validity of interviews improved if and only if organizations could invest in the training of those interviewers, right? Or if they adopt what you call the structured interviews. And what is structured interviews basically? It's about the using predefined list of questions during the interview process, right? And those predefined questions should be related to the specific job that those job applicants are to be hired for, right? And most often than not, those structured interviews are situational, applying to the situations that relate to that job function, basically. Also, we'll be looking at assessment centers, right, as a tool for selecting employees. Basically, they are used to select managers from current employees of the organization, and the selection from those managers is from the current employees. So it's basically looking at employees at a lower level of the organization to promote them to the managerial positions, right? So assessment centers are tools that can be used for selection, right? And what these centers do is that they provide a content valid simulation of the major parts of or the major components of the managerial job for which those current employees are considered for, right? And a typical assessment center will basically or yeah, a typical center would last like 2 to 3 days, right? And would probably provide for a group of maybe 6 to 12 people or employees that are participating in the selection process, right? Also, you find out that such current employees that are selected using the assessment centers, right? They are those candidates, current employees that are candidates, they are assessed by trained observers when the assessment centers are being used, right? So also there are other techniques that are used in selecting employees, right? You have what you call the background checks, criminal background checks that are done during the hiring process, right, or selection process. You find out that those would be other techniques also for selecting employees. It could be background checks, polygraph testing, physical exams, drug tests, right, and credit checks. All those are done during the selection of employees. Training and development. You find out that no matter how effective a selection system or a selection process is or was, right, during the hiring or recruiting of employees, no matter how effective it is, most employees or individuals that come on board an organization, most often than not, will require additional training, right? What would this training be all about? Is about teaching operational and technical employees, right? Employees of an organization, teaching them how to do the job for which they were hired, right? And you find out that these trainings may come in form of on-the-job training, right? On-the-job training may be considered, how do we do things around here? Because in the selection process, they may have considered the knowledge, capabilities, or skills of the employee, right, or the individual who is being considered for hiring. But giving them on-the-job training is basically telling them that, in as much as you may have the knowledge or skills, but in this environment, because organizations are unique, in this particular organizational environment, this is how we do things here. That is why on-the-job training may be necessary, right? And you find out that other forms of having to teach them what they have to do on the job would be onboarding too. Onboarding could be a way to develop those human resources that have been selected, or the employees that have been selected to join new employees of an organization, right? Also, you find out that having to also evaluate their performance and provide them feedback is also necessary, right? Now, also, let's look at development. Development is all about teaching managers and professionals the skills that they need for their current job and future jobs, right? So, training is more like on the job, what they currently do, but development is, it has in its consideration when you're developing human resources within an organization, is it takes into consideration the current job functions of that employee and equally extends it to their future job functions or jobs they are most likely to occupy, job roles they are most likely to occupy in the future. So development developmental opportunities for employees takes into consideration not just the current jobs they do, but equally future jobs they may be doing for that organization. Now we'll be looking at assessing training needs, right? Assessing training needs will basically have to do with determining what the training needs of the employee is, and this would be done by a manager, right? And those assessing what training need the employee needs would be the first step to developing a training plan within the organization, right? Because given the identified gaps, maybe in knowledge or skills or behavior of an employee, when it's determined by the manager that there are those gaps, then the manager would most often than not recommend for training to actually cater for those gaps, to address those gaps in knowledge, maybe knowledge, skill, or maybe behavior, right? And that will be how organizations will come develop a plan in order to ensure that those employees get trained, right? The plan is to ensure that they get trained. So these are things that are considered during the training and development of employees. Further on training and development, right? You find out that there are many, there are several training and development methods that are available, right? And selection of methods depends on, or whatever training method that is adopted by an organization depends on many considerations, right? It could be financial considerations, how buoyant the organization is will determine what training method they may adopt for their employees, right? Or it could be, but the most important thing, most often than not, when considerations are being made on what training method should be selected, would be about the training content, right? What content is offered by that training method. Now, let's look at the common training methods. You have the lectures, right? Lectures will be all about when the training content is factual material, like lectures relate to factual materials, assigned reading, or even programmed learning. Those will all fall under lectures, right? Now we have another training method called the role play and case studies, right? It could be role playing or case discussion groups. So this is when the content is the content is interpersonal relations, or it involves group decision making. It's a method that allows for interpersonal contact, if that makes sense. Now we're also looking at another training method called on the job and vestibular training, right? On the job and vestibular training is basically when employees must learn a physical skill, a skill that is required or relevant to the job that they're about to do, right? This method allows for practice and actual use of the tools and materials or equipment that are necessary or relevant to the job that is being done, right? That's on the job training. Now you have the web-based and electronic training, right? The web-based or other digital media based training or electronic training, right? This allows for a mix of training content, right? And it's relatively easy to update and revise, right? And allows for participants to use variable schedule, maybe lower travel costs too, especially if the financial capacity of the organization isn't that much, right? So web-based training may be adopted if an organization is looking at saving cost on logistics for their employees that are to be trained, right? Now, but even however, there could be limitation in their capacity to simulate real activities, right, and facilitate for face-to-face interaction. So that would be a disadvantage of such web-based training or such training method, because of having to some interactions may require face-to-face most often than not for people to gain learning or for employees to get trained, right? Also, we'll be looking at the self-contained training facility, or what you call a corporate university. You find that more often than not in large corporations, right? Because large corporations, given whatever training needs they have, most often than not they can create an institution or the university, what you call corporate university, to actually take care of all the train or address the training needs of their employees. I mean, I could give you examples of organizations that do it. Where I work, Nigeria, where I come from, the Central Bank of Nigeria, which would be akin to like the Treasury of the United States, they have an institution that trains their own employees, right? And in extension could train other employees in the financial sector, maybe in the banking sector, right? Private organizations that are in the financial industry, right? So those the Central Bank of Nigeria's institution actually provides training to people in the financial industry beyond their own employees, right? Another organization that does it that I am aware of is like Emirates, the Emirates airline. They have an academy that trains their cabin crew, that trains, I think, their academy. I'm not so sure if it trains their pilots, but I know it trains their cabin crew, right? So they have a corporate university as well. So this would be some common methods of training. Now talk about evaluation of training, right? It's expected that managers should evaluate the effectiveness of whatever training they recommend for their employees, and eventually those employees attend. They should evaluate to see if whatever gaps that they identified earlier on, if those gaps were effectively addressed by the training, right? So basically they do that to ensure that training translates into improved performance on the job. Performance appraisal. Performance appraisal is a formal assessment of how well an employee is doing on their job, right? So why would the performance appraisal be done within organizations? It's basically to validate that the selection process was very effective, right? Because if performance of a new employee is if their performance is evaluated and they are seen to be very 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 efficient in their job role for which they were hired, or if they are seen to be high performers, then it validates the selection process, which basically must have said that this is a good fit for this job role, right? So having to evaluate a new employee's performance, or even every employee of an organization having to evaluate their performance, one of the reasons, especially if the person is a new hire, is to validate the selection process, that it was quite effective or that it went well, right? That whatever it sought to achieve was achieved, right? Performance appraisal actually does that. It validates the selection process. Also, it helps in making decisions about pay raises, promotions, and training. Why is that the case? You find out that, like where I used to work, right, after performance appraisals, right, there's something what we call the increments. So the increments, right, like merit-based pay. It happens after a performance appraisal, and it usually applies, those increments apply to your salary, and it takes effect at the next cycle. It takes effect in the subsequent year, the year after the appraisal has been done. Let me put it into perspective. So for instance, this is 2025, right? At the end of 2025, maybe by first quarter of 2026, let's say my performance for 2025 is evaluated, right? At the end of the day, whatever rating on performance I have, for instance, if I am the one who is being whose performance is being appraised, whatever ratings I have, let's say the ratings put me on, okay, where I used to work, you have four scale, we have it on a scale whereby you have the IN, like improvement needed, you have meet expectation, right? You have exceed expectation, and you have outstanding. Now, if the employee has meet expectation, that's like 1 point, right? Like one step. The one step translates to a financial component, if that makes sense, telling you how much increment, how much pay raise that person gets by virtue of their performance. Now, if it's someone who got an exceed expectation or an outstanding, that's like 2 steps. Now, the 2 steps translates to if they were on a particular step and earned this amount, they now move 2 steps, which is higher amount on whatever level they are on. That's about the increments on the same grade level or the same pay grade of the employee. So the employee is on a pay grade, but given the assessment of performance, they could get pay raises or increments. So such assessments, they are the way of the appraisal translating into the pay raise. The appraisal becomes a determinant for how much pay raise the employee gets, right? Also, you find out the appraisal too has some elements of it whereby recommendations for promotions are done too. So performance appraisals are also a basis for promotions within an organization, because employees of an organization most often than not are promoted based off how well they've performed, right, in their role, that earn them to move up higher within the organization or to move higher the hierarchy within the organization, right? Also, performance appraisal provides feedback to employees that enables them to improve their performance and plan future careers, right? So like where I used to work, at some point we had to start conducting performance appraisals twice a year rather than just once a year. And the idea behind that was, after the first appraisal for the first half of the year, it affords the employee opportunities to actually improve on their performance for the latter part of the year, if that makes sense. So performance appraisal basically provides the feedback to the employee earlier on to allow for them to improve their performance subsequently, right? So you find that something we may want to note is, just in tandem with what we're saying about performance appraisal, you find out that most colleges and universities use teaching evaluations at the end of the semester, right? That's a form of performance appraisal to assess how well they are doing in the teaching area, right? This is a form of performance appraisal through which students actually evaluate a teacher's performance. Furthering our discussion on performance appraisal, right? There are common appraisal methods out there, and well, two basic categories of appraisal methods, and they are the objective methods and the judgmental methods. So looking at objective measures of performance, what this does is basically measures actual output tangibly, right? Example, like number of units produced, right? Scrap rate, dollar volume of sales, and number of claims processed. Looking at opportunity bias, this is like when a measure of performance is contaminated, like when the measure of performance incorrectly assesses performance, when it's not a valid measure or a valid assessment for performance, right? It doesn't really measure or really assess the performance correctly, right? And it's contaminated also. It could be based off some external influences, right? That's why such contamination happens, or that's why it doesn't really measure or assess the performance correctly, right? That's it. Now looking at like the judgmental method, or let's say the judgmental appraisal method, right? This would involve ranking and rating techniques, right? You find out that it compares employees directly with each other, but it's difficult or challenging to do that with large number of employees. You understand, having to compare them against or compare their performances against each other, right? And it's also difficult to use this method when you're trying to make comparisons across work groups. Now, under this method, employees are ranked only on overall performance, and this method does not provide useful information for employee feedback, right? It doesn't look at the employee specifically. It's actually basing the employee's performance assessment. It's basing it based off another their colleagues performance assessment, so there's kind of comparison, right? So it doesn't really provide useful feedback on how well this employee has done as an individual. It's basically saying this employee has done well in comparison. The measure of how well or success is not on an individual basis, so it doesn't really convey useful information to individual employees. Looking at the rating method of the judgmental appraisal methods, right? So this rating, there's for rating, it compares each employee with a fixed standard. It uses like graphic rating scales of job performance dimensions, and employees are rated on a standard scale, right? So basically here, using the rating method, there is no comparison with other employees when you're actually assessing an employee's performance, right? A rating scale basically provides a standard for which employee performance is rated against, right? Now, in constructing rating scales, performance dimensions that are relevant to job performance must be selected, right? In particular, they should actually focus on the job behaviors and results rather than on personality traits or attitudes, if that makes sense. Now, looking at the behaviorally anchored rating scales, right? This is a sophisticated rating method where supervisors construct a rating scale that is associated with behavioral anchors, right? What does that mean? It identifies relevant performance dimensions, like we said, right? And then generates anchors that describe specific observable behaviors that are typical of each performance level, if that makes sense. Now, still looking at performance appraisals, we find out that we said earlier on that we talked about biases, right? But we're talking about biases with regards to interviewer biases earlier on, right? And how that could be overcome. And in the same vein, trust me, in the same vein that interviewers their biases could be stemmed down by training, we'll find out that bias errors that emanate or the errors that emanate from assessments of performance, like the errors managers make when assessing performance of their employees, those errors too can be contained, or those errors too, those biases or errors done by managers during appraisal, those errors can actually be reduced or overcome using training too, by training those managers. But let's quickly look at the bias errors that may exist during performance appraisal. These errors are done by managers who appraise performance basically. Now, there's something called recency error. Recency error is when the manager is basing their judgment, right? Is basing their judgment on the subordinate's most recent performance because it is the most easily recalled, right? So you find out that an employee who probably was doing very, very well, you understand, from the beginning of the year till maybe shortly before the appraisal period, the employee's performance now probably declined, right? The manager, if the manager doesn't document performance and is able to actually relate to the earlier quality performance of that employee, how well that employee performed earlier on, right? If the manager is only considerate of the most recent performance of the employee, which is a decline in performance, then most often than not, when they're assessing the employee for the whole period of the whole performance period, the only thing that comes into mind is that short time frame the employee had poor performance prior to appraisal. That is an error if a manager bases the appraisal of the entire performance period only based on that short time frame. And that short time frame, if it's done, if it is adopted by the manager, that would be a recency error for that appraisal or for that performance appraisal. Now we have errors of leniency and strictness. Now this has to do with when the manager is being either too lenient or too strict, or trying to rate all employees as average, right? Trying to rate all employees as average too may be called what you call the central tendency error, right? So central tendency error is also inclusive in the performance appraisal biases, right? Which is when the manager tends to take a middle course in the appraisal of performance, right? On all areas, trying to take a middle course. It's just like, let's say, when you're trying to fill out a survey, and let's say the survey for each of the responses, right? There's a 1 to 5 point, right? And you find out that if you want to take a central course or central tendency, if your error is such that is the central tendency error, then most often than not you will be ticking the 3 on a scale of 1 to 5, right? You'll be ticking the 3, the central of those 2 points, right? That will be central tendency error. Now you have what you call the halo error, right? This is basically allowing the assessment of the employee on one dimension to spread to that of employees rating on other dimensions. What do we mean by that? Let's say the performance criteria for which the employees are assessed, let's say we're looking at punctuality, for instance, right? And we're also looking at the employee's knowledge capabilities on the job, or how much knowledge or how well the employee has applied their knowledge towards performance on the job, right? So assuming such an employee is such a high performer on the job, very good high performer, and turns out very good very good quality of job, right? Their performance on the job is top notch, but this employee is used to coming late to work, and punctuality is also a performance criteria that is evaluated. The employee is evaluated based on how early they are to work, how they are always at work, right? If they are absent from work, or if they show up late at work, employees, that would have to relate to punctuality. Now, assuming this manager, in appraising this employee's performance, now tries to appraise the employee very well, even on punctuality, because the employee delivers high quality jobs, right? Without taking into consideration that this employee, for instance, shows up late to work every time and should be given a poor assessment on that performance criteria per punctuality. But halo error is when this manager, because the employee turns out or shuns out very quality jobs, is now actually assessing their punctuality as highly because they are assessed high on the other performance or the knowledge capabilities that are applied on the job, if that makes sense. So using one element of, or one dimension, or one criterion of performance, the whatever assessment the manager makes on that criterion, transferring it to another criterion, right, which probably is not as good or as bad as the other criteria, but basing all of them as the same, that will be halo error. Now, on performance appraisal, there's a new concept that is found most times in organizations today, right? Whereby to actually ensure for fairness in the performance appraisal, right? Or to actually make it very, very robust. So it's not like biases are really existent in the process, right? Or it's something like favorites, like it kind of gives a balance and a holistic view of the employee's performance, because the employee most often than not has work relationships with not only the manager. Most often than not, they could have work relationships with their peers, or even have work relationships with maybe even customers, right? Or even an employee that reports to a manager may equally be the manager to another employee, which means that they equally have interactions with their subordinates as well. So this 360-degree feedback or performance appraisal is a performance appraisal system in which managers are evaluated by everyone around them. They're evaluated, or an employee is evaluated by their boss, by their peers as well as their subordinates, right? So it provides a richer array of performance information on which to base an appraisal. The diagram on this slide is just an illustration of the graphic rating scale, right, for a bank teller. It provides, it conveys information on what such rating scales look like, or what information is contained on rating scales. So you may want to familiarize yourselves with that, right? I mean, like I told you, where I used to work in Nigeria, we had a rating scale for assessing performance where I told you that for improvement needed, that was a 0, right? The person earned no points for such performance, right? Or an employee doesn't earn points for such performance, or a step towards increment for such performance. Now, where the employee meets expectation, which is a skill too, the person gets 1 step, and employee getting to the scale where they exceed expectation, that's 2 steps, and outstanding 2 steps. So this is like an idea of what rating scales could be like in organizations. On this slide here also is an illustration of the behaviorally anchored rating scale we talked about earlier on. Performance feedback. Performance feedback would be considered the final step in the performance appraisal system, right? So you find out that employees usually meet privately with their managers or their supervisors to actually discuss their appraisal, right? Or their performance evaluation, right? So you find out that performance feedback is best given in a private meeting between the employee and their immediate supervisor, right? And it's more effective if managers are trained to conduct feedback interviews, right? So you find out that in such meetings the focus is on the appraisal discussion, right? They look at the assessed level of performance, how and why the assessment was made, right? And how the employee's performance can be improved in the future. Those are things that happen during the performance feedback, or during the meeting where feedback on performance is provided, right? So something we may want to know is that providing performance feedback is often a difficult task for managers, right? And this is especially the case when the feedback is negative, right? So if this employee, based off assessment, has poor performance, has been assessed to have poor performance, right? Is not a high performer. It's usually tasking and challenging for managers to conduct such meetings, right? So you find out or when there are strong feelings, right? It could be strong feelings that are positive or strong feelings that are negative between the manager and their subordinate. It actually makes such performance appraisal meetings, or where feedback are given, it makes it challenging for the manager. Determining compensation. So you find out that when organizations attract human resource, it behoves on such organization not only to attract human resource, but also to maintain their human resource, right? And how they do this is, you understand, how they do this is also by development, right? They do it by training and development, right? Beyond training and development, other ways they could do it or maintain their human resource or their workforce after they've attracted them or hired them into the organization. Another thing they will do is to actually make very strategic investments that can keep their most valued employees. What do I mean? They can do that by actually instituting or establishing or putting in place very effective compensation and benefit programs, right? So that their talents, their top talents will not be attracted to joining other organizations, right? Because if they feel well compensated in the organization that has attracted them, right? And if they feel that the benefits that are offered by the organization are ones that actually suit their needs, then they are more likely to remain with the organization, which means the organization is more able to maintain their human resource, right? No. So looking at compensation, since that's an element of what keeps the top talents or actually maintains the human resources of an organization. Compensation is basically the financial remuneration that is given by an organization to its employees for the work they do for them, right? So it's like the employee contributes to the organization by delivering on their task, right? Or delivering on their job roles. And the organization basically compensates the employee by paying them for their services. That's why they give them money, they pay them wage or salary as kind of in exchange or as a balance for the job the employee has done for the organization, right? Now, why would organizations actually provide compensation? Basically, is to provide their employees with a reasonable standard of living, and it's also provide a tangible measure of an individual's value to the organization. So how much an organization actually pays their employee tells the employee to what extent whatever jobs they deliver on, or whatever job roles they occupy in the organization, how valuable it is to the organization, how core to the organization's outcomes their job roles are. That would be reflected in how much pay they are given by the organization. So based off how much they are giving, they can tell if their job roles are of high value to the organization or not. Still on determining compensation, we'll be looking at forms of compensation, right? Now, something I want us to note is that a good compensation system, right, or a good in an organization, it can help attract qualified applicants. It can actually help attract top talents to an organization, right? And like we rightly said, if the compensation is good, right, and the benefits are good within an organization, it helps retain their existing employees. So they are not attracted to other organizations, right? Also, it actually stimulates for high performance, right, at a cost that is reasonable to the organization's industry. So to set up a successful system, you find out that the management of an organization, right, or managers within an organization have to make decisions about wage levels, the wage structure, and individual wage determinations and the determinations regarding wage, right? So looking at wages, what's wage? Wage would be hourly compensation that are paid to operating employees, right? Also, there are certain things there's something called wage level decision, a concept called wage level decision, right? This is basically about management policy decisions about whether or policies that are within an organization that either compel the organization, right, to pay more. It's all about wage level decisions, all about policies an organization have in place that helps them in deciding how the organization wants to compensate their employees, right? In in comparison with what is being paid to employees of such competence elsewhere. So how do I mean, or what the labor market offers to to the competence level of such employees, if that makes sense. So such wage level decisions would help organizations decide if they want to lead the market, right? Lead the market will be paying above what the market rate is for such employees competence, right? Or they can either choose to, their policy might be, the policy within the organization might be that in compensating employees of the organization, they would want to lag the market, meaning that whatever they are paying their employees is less than what the going rate for that competence level is at the labor market, right? Or they may decide to match the market, meaning that they are paying the employee equally, or they are paying the employee same as what the labor market offers for their competence level. So wage level decision has to do with policies the organization has in place with regards to if they're going to lag the market, if they're going to lead the market, or if they're going to match the market with in relation to compensation, right? Now, you find out that when managers make those wage level decisions, they need to know what the maximum or minimum average wages are for particular jobs in the labor market, right? They need to know what the labor market offers for such competence level before they are able to make such decisions, right? There's another concept called the wage structure decision, right? This is accomplished with the use of a job evaluation. So that wage structure decision is basically to assess the worth of each job relative to other jobs, right? So when you do a job evaluation, it tells you elements of the job and it tells you to what extent those elements of that job are compensable, right? The compensable factors in that job, right? It tells you why that job may be paid for more than other jobs depending on what the responsibilities or what the competence level for an employee that occupies that job role, right? So the simplest method for creating a wage structure would be to rank jobs from those that should be paid the most to those that should be paid the least, right? Another way to do that is setting actual wage rates based on a combination of survey data and the wage structure that results from job evaluation, right? Whereby jobs of equal value are often grouped into wage groups for ease in the administration of wages, right? Now you have what you call the individual wage decisions also, right? Whereby they follow the wage level and wage structure decision and concern. They are really um the more focused on how much to pay each employee in a particular job. So it's not like they're looking at each employee as an individual, as based off the competencies each individual employee has, right? And we find out that the internet is changing compensation patterns because job seekers and current employees can now more easily get a sense of what the market rate is for their competence level, right? So the internet is impacting how employees react to their compensation within organizations. Also, we'll be looking at what you call salary, right? Salary is what is paid to employees for their total contribution and is not based on hours worked, just like the wage. So salary isn't paid hourly, and you have what you call the incentives. These are special compensation opportunities that are usually tied to performance, right? And some examples of incentives would be like sales commissions or maybe bonuses. Those would be incentives. Determining benefits. Benefits are things of value that, other than compensation, that an organization provides to its employees, right? So beyond the remuneration, there are other things like perks, right? Or let's say insurances, insurance policies, all those things that are provided to employees of an organization besides compensation that actually cater to the well-being of the employees of an organization. Those would be considered benefits, right? And you find out that there are different types of employee benefits that exist in organizations out there, right? One of those benefits would be like pay for time off, right? When employees are paid when they are not working, right? When they are not at their jobs physically. It's called pay for time not work. And such benefits would be in organizations will come in form of vacations, right? When employees are paid when they're on vacations or when they're on holidays, right? It could equally include things like sick leave, because when employees are on sick leave, they are not actively at work and they are being paid when they're out of the office. Or it could be what you call unemployment compensation, right? Those will fall under pay for time not worked, right? Now you have the life, health, and other insurance that comes. Organizations may provide their employees or avail them opportunities to access dental, health, and vision insurance, right? Those would be, and they could actually provide their employees with life insurance as well. Where I used to work back in Nigeria, right? Our employers actually catered for our life insurances, right? Even here in Francis Marion University, there's a life insurance policy in place for employees of Francis Marion University. So those would be benefits because that is not salary that is being paid to me in Francis Marion University, right? Having to provide some life insurance for me as their employee, that is not part of my salary. So that would be considered benefit for me being an employee of Francis Marion University, right? Now you have what you call the service benefits, right? And that would include like tuition, reimbursement, retirement plans, and all that, right? Now you also have what you call the cafeteria benefit plans. This is such a plan or such benefit that allows employees to choose the benefits package that is most meaningful to them, whereby organizations actually have an array of benefits for the same type of let's say if it's health insurance, for instance, in Francis Marion, you have the standard health insurance whereby employees pay more monthly, and you have the, I think, the basic health insurance, that's what it's called. They pay they pay less premiums monthly, but they have high deductibles. So it's Francis Marion offers these two options whereby you have the standard health plan, health insurance plan, right? That you could pay high premiums and lower deductibles, or you another insurance plan whereby the basic, whereby you could pay lower premiums but higher deductibles. So cafeteria benefit is when the like Francis Marion is not just offering one type of health insurance but having like two in place, so employees have the option of choosing which one suits their needs more, right? So that would be about the cafeteria benefit plans. These are all types of employee benefits that exist within organization, right? So cafeteria allows workers to choose additional benefits on top of some benefits provided to all, right? That's what we're trying to say. Now, you find out that in response to economic pressures, right, many organizations have actually reduced employee benefits over time. They've gradually done that, like particularly healthcare coverage or reduced retirement plan contributions. That's because of maybe reduced revenues by organization, but that's happening. But like we'll always say, if organizations intend on maintaining the human resource that they've attracted within the organization, if they want to ensure that most often than not, in most cases, that there's the less likelihood that those employees would seek employment elsewhere, they would want to have very, very, very attractive compensation and benefit programs within such organization. Managing knowledge workers. So which employees would be considered knowledge workers in organizations? These are employees whose contributions to the organization are based on what they know, right? And you find out that such knowledge workers, they have highly specialized trainings. Their professions, most times they are engineers, scientists, or computer scientists. Most often than not, they have high starting salaries, or they are highly compensated, right, in comparison to other employees of an organization, and they are usually difficult to retain. And whatever knowledge they possess, they become obsolete quickly, right? So you find out that these knowledge workers tend to work in high technology firms and are usually experts, right? And they love to work, most often than not, knowledge workers or employees that are knowledge workers, they work independently, and they tend to identify more strongly with their profession than with the organization, right? So if we were engineers, then if there's like a a professional association, a professional body for engineers, you find out that such knowledge workers are more aligned with those professional bodies than if they actually are to the organization they work for. That is usually the case with the knowledge workers, right? And you find out also that the knowledge workers, right, they are, as the importance of the information driven jobs grow, the need for knowledge workers would equally grow as well, right? And these knowledge workers they have the need to keep their skills current with continuous training. So most often than not, organizations find themselves investing heavily or investing financial resources a lot in making sure that the skills and knowledge of these their knowledge workers are kept up to date, right? So you find out that, yeah, because they require specialized trainings, they cost a lot to have them trained. Now we want to see how knowledge workers, managing them, how that relates with the labor market, right? You find out that always in the labor market there's a very strong demand at all times for these knowledge markets in the labor market, and organizations that need knowledge workers often of most often than not offer high starting salaries or high sign-on bonuses to attract them, right? And most often than not, you find out that they keep adjusting their compensation to actually be in tandem with what the labor market rates are, right? Most often than not, they do upward adjustments to ensure that these knowledge workers, that they maintain and retain them, so they don't leave their organizations for other organizations that may pay more. Contingent and temporary workers, right? These this type of employees would also be called peripheral employees, right? Why I call them peripheral is they are not core employees, they're not permanent or full-time employees. Most often than not, they may be independent contractors, on-call workers, contract and leased employees, or what you may call part-time workers, right? And in recent years, the number of such employees, the contingent on temporary employees in the workforce, in recent years, there has been an increase, right, in the number of them within organizations because of the evolving nature of organizations and the what you call the VUCA environment, where VUCA is like volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in the environment. So usually having contingent and temporary workers in place allows the organization some form of flexibility in order to adapt to their changing environment, if that makes sense, right? Now, how do organizations manage the contingent and temporary workers? Now, there's strategic need to maintain flexibility in staffing levels, right, and to control labor cost. And what does that require? It requires that there's careful advanced HR planning, right? And there's an understanding of how to effectively utilize contingent workers and also assessing the real cost of using such contingent and temporary employees, right? So in managing this type of employees, you find out that yes, it requires very advanced or like HR planning in advance, right? And also having to actually balance the cost versus the benefits, if that makes sense.